Chapter 10. 1961 was a year of change. Around us everything was moving so quickly. The Africans were to be given one man, one vote, a democracy, and thus, despite all the assurances from the British government and some of the Kenya's politicians, they would swamp the European influence. Increasingly, it could be seen that there would be little or no place for the European settler. The Africans would demand the land. Astonished, Jane and I listened to the BBC Overseas Service broadcasting distorted descriptions of events in Kenya. The only European the BBC seemed to know or care about was Michael Blundell, a leader of the Kenya settlers who seemed to follow a political line akin to that of the British government. Other European politicians, however successful at the polls, were ignored. Only Michael Blundell talked the language UK wanted to hear, so only he was mentioned in the BBC broadcasts. Warwick Waddy Fear had been promoted to sales manager. He was a large man, a quality cricketer who, as a teenager, had been given a trial by Hampshire. A wicket-keeper and middle-order batsman, he was later to score 65 runs in even time off a visiting MCC side. So he was a high-profile sportsman, a fact that would do Coopers no harm. He exuded self-confidence, was a knowledgeable farmer, and was married to June, née Moore, one of the daughters of the pedigree Jersey breeder I had met next to Bryn Glas Dundori. Having filled the sales manager position, Bob Hammond now offered me the new position of assistant sales manager, so as to free up Waddy from work with the European farmer. Waddy was to concentrate on developing our business with the new emerging African farmers. The long-term objective was to make sure that Coopers took the lead with the Africans, who would obviously come to dominate our market. Jane and I discussed our problems regarding our future with our old Jura Rock neighbour Ken Jocelyn. Ken was a comparatively recent settler, having been a farmer and cattle dealer in England. In fact, he scandalised T-Falls farmers with his dealing. He would buy cattle at a sale and resell them at a profit at the next sale. The local farmers were not sure that this was seemly. Anyway, although his arrival to settle as a farmer in Kenya could hardly have been worse timed, he was always interested in a deal. He offered to take over our sheep loan and to buy our farm at a slightly enhanced price over the same number of years as we were paying Colonel Corbett. I agreed and wrote to Bob Hammond accepting the position of assistant sales manager. We were now due for our long leave in the UK, and Ma agreed we could base ourselves at Lumley. I had worked hard at becoming a proficient salesman, buying relevant books and attempting to put their lessons into practice. In particular, I studied Alfred Tack's Sell Your Way to Success. So when our UK leave came up, I asked if the company would pay for me to attend a 3-day tax sales course in London. The company seemed doubtful that it would be worth the cost, so I arranged to pay it for myself. Then Bob Hammond asked me to attend 2 5-day courses, Development of Executives and Sales Management, at Sundridge Park Management Centre in Kent. In addition, I was required to spend a week at Cooper's Global HQ in Berkhamsted, Hertfordshire. From the nearest railway station, I arrived at Sundridge Park by taxi. "Let's hope these courses help to improve England's exports," I exclaimed naively to the taxi driver, who had been very helpful and friendly. "Don't know anything about that, Gov. Just as long as I get my halfpenny worth of life each day, that's all I worry about," was the laconic reply. The courses themselves set me firmly on my future path. Development of Executives included not only lectures but also interactive case studies. In one of them I had to act as a whining site manager, finding all the excuses for being behind on a construction job. The course member who acted as a visiting manager to the imaginary site was indeed a civil engineer. He got so immersed in the acting that he lost his temper with me, saying my excuses were typical of the phony excuses he got from site managers he had to visit on his job. Some of the lecture notes were excellent, and I kept them for the rest of my working life. One evening, the lecturer for the Powers of Persuasion section, a lawyer, voiced his surprise at my erudition when propped up against a bar. "Oh no, it's not the bar, it's the subject," I replied. We had been discussing Rhodesia and the way in which, in my opinion, Roy Walensky, the Rhodesian leader, was being let down by the British government. The lecturer was sufficiently impressed to ask me to make a winding-up speech at the end of the course dinner. Sales management introduced me to a new bunch of course members, including a manager who came down from the Midlands. The students were agog when they saw this man arriving in a Wolseley with a wireless aerial. They were most reverential when talking to this gentleman. Also on the course there was a member of the Clark Shoe family, who was an example of true professionalism as salesman. On the first evening in the small bar, with the course members crushed close up against one another, he and I started a discussion. To my astonishment, without apparently looking down, he referred accurately to exactly what shoes I was wearing at that moment. What an example of professionalism, I thought. I bet he knows the makes of shoes each person in the room is wearing. On the last day of each course, Mr. Connolly, the director of the centre, gave a talk. This showed that, in his opinion, Britain was going steadily downhill and was in danger of becoming virtually broke. This was about 10 years before it did in effect happen. The result was electric. The course members were astounded. They quoted the newspaper's recording, "Once again export records for British motor cars." "Yes, 3% this year, while the world market has ridden 2 or 3 times as fast," came the reply. "Well, what are you going to do about it?" "Gentlemen, I tell every course that comes through this management centre." "Well, we must tell our MPs." "Well, yes, but first let us ask ourselves, what are our country's strengths?" "The greatest strength we have is our technical know-how." So we have to concentrate on products with high technological content." "I agree," replied Mr. Connolly. There were certainly some managers who were startled and convinced by that exchange. However, as far as Britain was concerned, there was little change to be seen in the country's commercial objectives for many years. I went to the Assistant Director, Pat Gibson, for career advice. "Take the diploma in Marketing and Sales Management and then study finance." It was some of the best advice I ever received. Compared to the 5-day Sundridge Park course, the 3-day tax sales course was just a reinforcement of my determination that my sales force must be really professional. They would ensure we would hold on to our large market share. On the 15th of May, I joined the Institute of Marketing and Sales Management, whose motto was, "Bold in selling, honest in telling." Based at the White Swan, my days at Cooper's HQ in Berkhamsted were uneventful. In general, I was made to feel that my visit was a bit of a nuisance, an interruption to the cosy work routine. Particularly was this the case with the technical staff. I lunched at the senior executives' mess and noted with interest how the gin and Italians flowed. Really, pleasant as everyone was, we had little in common to talk about. On my last evening, with nothing to do, I decided to go out for a walk. As I passed out of the pub door, 2 men who were entering grabbed me, one by each arm. Peter Hanscom, export manager, and Ian Lau, advertising executive, frog-marched me out for the most enjoyable pub crawl. I found the visits to our families quite stressful. Mum had settled into a lowly paid life of livestock management, rearing and showing pedigree pigs and cattle. I arrived at her house to find there my distraught sister, whose American USAF husband had left her and England taking her hard-earned ice show money with him. The USAF closed ranks, and no action was ever taken by them on the matter. I called at Dad's office at lunchtime and was advised to search over a number of pubs known to him at around that hour of the day. Eventually I found him against a large bar in a prestigious pub, and I could see that he was uncertain how pleased he was to see me. Conversely, I started also to feel that Mum and Dad were sensitive as to how long I would be spending with each of them. Back at his office after lunch, Dad was distraught about his broken marriage, loss of contact with his daughter, me in Kenya, and now Richard in America. I thought no one could have done more for his wife and children, and now he had lost them all. He kept on top of his drinking sufficiently well for his job as assistant London agent for the Rhodesian Railways, in which he was successful. He was well respected in the city. Lumley Croft had been Jane's family home all her life, and she loved it dearly. To me it was a large, cold, somewhat austere house, with a garden that visitors such as us seemed to be expected to put some work into. Fortunately, there were some fruit trees which required attention, and I could happily spend some time on them, reliving my post-school years with fruit in Kent. There was a hard tennis court, on which Ma's friends, Commander Chevy Chevalier and his wife Pat, would be the core of the tennis parties. Ma's friends tended to be Navy, Captain Patrick Barber and his wife Barbara, Vice Admiral Thistleton Smith, etc. Exceptions to this were Joyce MacDonald Smith and her husband Sam. He had served in the colonial service in West Africa from 1931 to 1957 and now worked in the southern counties for Guinness. In 1936, Joyce, who had been an international hockey player, had had an unpleasant encounter with a crocodile that had grabbed her and damaged one hip. She was an exceptionally charming person, with an ability to see things to praise wherever she went. She did this without, in any way, appearing to gush. What a great skill, I thought. Jane's younger brother Johnny, aged 22, seemed to me to have been overwhelmed by lack of a father and the requirements to live up to the high standards of his family. He had run away from schools, and there was considerable doubt as to his future. One of the family jokes was the extent of his tone deafness. I had a theory that nobody is tone deaf. It is just a question of transferring what one hears to one's voice. Johnny could tell a high note from a low one on the piano, and I was keen to help him. So for 3 days we worked at it until, to his great pleasure, he could sing Galway Bay to my basic piano accompaniment. He's a tall, presentable, well-spoken, jolly person, I mused. I gave him my copy of Sell Your Way to Success. Inside the front cover I wrote, "Gold and silver have I none," but it was the best way I could find to wish him well. Jane's brother Jeremy and his wife Janet invited us up to their home in Harrogate for a few days, taking advantage of our visit to throw a cocktail party for friends. As far as I could tell, these were all Jeremy's Oxbridge colleagues in ICI management. Janet's father was on the board of ICI, the largest company in the UK, and Jeremy was in the ICI Terraline division. While I had been through public school, I was certainly not Oxbridge. I had left England 9 years ago, since when Kenya had been my home. I felt we had little in common. The visitors seemed to make little effort to engage me in interesting conversation. I felt out of place. Perhaps they saw me as a would-be colonel with a chip on his shoulder. Jane fared better, being well versed in English social mores. Towards the end of the evening, a close friend of Jeremy's showed a mild interest in my assertion that Peugeot was taking over the East African market for motor cars. I thought the British seemed to be living in a dream world of their own. They seemed not to understand, or care to understand, how UK's commercial position was declining around the world. In my small part of the world, I could see people turning to other manufacturers, French, German or Japanese. We took Nigel to visit Ma's parents, Jane's grandparents, in Beckenham, where they had a 3-storied semi-detached house. He had been a civil engineer attached to the Admiralty. When he was working in Hong Kong with his family, Ma, aged 18, and Jane's naval father had met and had soon become engaged to be married. Jane was particularly fond of her grandmother, who in turn expressed delight with Nigel. She had a winning way of referring to me as Jane's Ian. Ma's sister Joyce and her husband John Ransford were most welcoming and friendly. They offered to look after Nigel at their home in Beckenham, so that their daughter Wendy could escort us to the latest show in town, My Fair Lady. A tall, slim brunette, Wendy earned her living as a personal secretary in the theatrical world. She was good company for us, and it was a great evening. Soon our leave was over and we returned to Kenya, to be followed later by a letter to Jane from Ma. In it she asked Jane to tell your husband that it was common good manners after staying with relations around England to send letters of thanks. "But you sent letters?" I asked Jane. "Yes, of course." "Well, didn't you sign them from both of us so that I was included?" From Kenya I wrote a careful letter of apology and explanation to my mother-in-law of 2 years. During our absence there had been some drama with Sandra. Apparently she had taken our non-appearance so badly she had retired in a serious sulk under the house, whence KR could not get her to emerge, however hard he tried. Eventually, fearing for her life, because she refused all food that he laid down in front of her, KR went next door to Jocelyn's to ask for help. They managed to persuade her to come out and took her home with them. After that, whenever we went on our local holidays, we took Sandra with us. In 1959, Cooper's was sold to the Wellcome Foundation. We were assured that there would be no early changes. In general, Cooper personnel seemed to think that following the acquisition, the company would have access to more funding and therefore have a sounder future. Our Kenyan Cooper pension values were to be transferred to the Wellcome UK pension scheme. Otherwise, we stayed on the local Kenya company terms and conditions. Cooper's had obtained a small house for Jane and me at low rent from Wellcome on their veterinaries research station in Quebec. The house had a beautiful potato creeper and bougainvillea climbing on it. The garden was on 3 levels and full of canna. From it we could gaze for miles across to the near end of the Aberdares. We settled in comfortably, and Violet MacDonald's elder son Anthony, a forestry officer in Tanganyika, stayed a couple of nights with us while he was on a course in Nairobi. He was very surprised to see Nigel's ability at controlling a football while he was barely 2 years old. Cooper's was finding there was increasing competition with taxophene cattle dips, so we held a reps meeting up country where we decided on tactics to convince the farmers that our formulation was the best. We had noticed that when water was added, our dip apparently held its emulsion much better than competitive formulations. This was easy to demonstrate to the farmer with 2 glasses of water. Into one the Cooper dip was mixed, and direct comparison could be made with the other glass and its competitive dip. The content of the competitive formulation could be seen to have sunk to the bottom of the glass, whereas the Cooper toxaphene was still properly emulsified. Nowadays, my sport consisted of second-team mixed doubles tennis at the Impala Club, previously the Old Cantuarians. There also I acted for a time as assistant rugby coach to Denny O'Loughlin, who had been an Irish trialist. I was particularly pleased to identify and promote the rugby of Mike Andrews. He was a wing forward, the position I had played in. He was tall, fast, and had all the abilities to be a top player. "Have you been given a Kenya trial?" I asked. "No," was the simple reply. "Why not?" Dunno. I watched him closely at training and in club matches. At casual observation, he could appear to be lazy. Given the opportunity, he would stroll to the next scrum or line-out. He gave little impression of eagerness. Look, you will run please all the time. You will exude eagerness at every pore, I instructed. And when you get your trial, you will wear the brightest coloured socks you can find to make sure you're in the selector's eyes all the time. Before long, Mike got his trial, and he eventually became captain of the East African rugby team. I now started studying for what would be my first qualifications since matriculation, 17 years previously. I signed up to a correspondence course to obtain the marketing diploma of the Institute of Marketing and Sales Management. My tutor was based in South Africa, and my papers and his comments had to travel back and forth by airmail. Jane had consistently urged me to get a qualification, so I was jolly well going to do it. I allocated 10 hours a week to this work. Added to the time required by my new job of assistant sales manager, it meant that my time was well used up with work. When we went to the coast for a short break at the end of the year, I took my coursework with me. This meant that sometimes Jane and Nigel would walk out to the beach alone, leaving me working, sweating in a sweltering hotel room with a fan whirring fitfully in the ceiling. Despite this, it was during this time at the Nyali Beach Hotel that our second child was conceived. I seemed to be getting minor ailments. At the coast, the wax in my ears seemed to expand, or indeed explode, so that I was quite unable to hear. I understood a little of what my father had endured all his life with his deafness. Automatically, one has sympathy for a blind person. It is so obvious what their handicap is. People give no attention to hearing loss. I felt strangely incapacitated and insufficient, being suddenly shut off from voices or indeed any sound. Back in Nairobi, a doctor sluiced out my ears, and it was to be a twice-a-year necessity for the rest of my life. The malaria I had contracted 9 years ago in Rhodesia would recur from time to time. I knew what to take for this. It would then fade away to reappear a few months later, each time with less severity. I started getting pain in my hips, to the extent that walking became increasingly difficult. Serving at tennis had become difficult enough anyway, with my polio arm's inability to throw the ball with any accuracy. Now the movement of my serving arm was agony. I put it all down to the stress I'd put my hips and right shoulder to when goalkeeping at hockey. Sallying forth out of the goal mouth and throwing myself down on my right elbow and hip in front of the forward with the ball had been a standard saving technique. I was now paying for it. One day, ignoring the lift, I found myself quite unable to climb the 4 flights of steps to my office. Something must be done. I must see a doctor. Jane scoffed at my increasing difficulty. "It's just old age," she said. Fortunately, in Nairobi, there was Dr. McCaldin, and his son who had joined his practice and who had, incidentally, married Barbara, one of my physiotherapists at the BMH. Having heard me out, examined me, flexed my limbs, etc., the old man said, "This is interesting. I'm uncertain, but I'm going to take a blood sample. Come back in a week's time." A week later, he commented, "Well, I have to say I've never come across anything like this at your age, 32. Your blood has a high uric acid level. In other words, you have gout." He prescribed a change in my eating and drinking habits. I had to stop drinking anything to do with a grape, and indeed stop drinking anything alcoholic, except possibly gin from time to time. I must eat nothing containing liver or kidneys, and I was to start on a medicinal regime of colchicum and the anti-inflammatory butazolidine. The results were miraculous. Within days my limbs were loosening, and within 3 weeks I was a new man. My shoulder and hips seemed to be totally pain-free and moved easily. After 6 months I was able to stop the medication. Tanganyika has been given its independence, its uhuru, and Julius Nyerere Mwalimu is the Prime Minister. He's one of 26 children. What on earth would they all live on? The Tanganyikans, I mean. Arthur Crowther always said that no worthwhile mineral finds would ever be made in East Africa. How long will it be now before Kenya is independent? And what will be the future then for the European and the European children? There is talk that the Europeans will be guaranteed some sort of land price if they sell out to the African. But can you believe it? These politicians will say anything to keep the Kenya-European working and developing the economy. What does Mwalimu mean anyway? I went to my Swahili English dictionary. A learned man, a teacher, a schoolmaster. Well, good luck to Tanganyika. I heard an amusing story of the Independence Parade. Apparently, twinning the governor, as he passed behind the bandmaster, he leant over and said, "Same old tunes, bandmaster." While still conducting, the bandmaster turned his head and replied, "Yes, sir, and the same old speech, if I may say so, sir." Early January 1962, Cousin Wendy took 6 weeks off from work and came to visit us. December to February being the hot, dry season in Kenya, generally speaking, the sun can be guaranteed all day, every day. We decided to introduce Wendy and Sandra the Scotty to our old friend in the Nairobi Beach Hotel. "Let's get away really early," I urged, "something about 4:30 a.m. The girls agreed. Daybreak in Kenya is about 6 a.m. and changes little throughout the year as the country straddles the equator. So we made our way in the dark through Nairobi onto the 30 miles or so of new tarmac that had been laid outside Nairobi. Our headlights probed the road for potholes and obstacles such as wild game. We had 300 miles to go to Mombasa, and as the road appeared to be free of traffic, I pressed down on the accelerator. There was no speed limit outside the city, and soon we were buzzing along at 80 miles an hour. Suddenly, 19 miles out of Nairobi, it seemed to me that the road colour ahead had changed. There was a brown strip in front of us, which seemed to be moving right to left. I jammed on the brakes, and we slewed to a halt no more than 5 yards from a raging torrent. Unseasonal storms had broken in the Ngong Hills during the night, and the resulting floodwaters were now roaring down the riverbed, 3 feet above the bridge that had crossed it. The road was completely impassable. In fact, we were on a road peninsula, the torrent ahead of us and a lake on either side. If we had travelled a few more yards, we would have been carried away, never to be seen again. There was no alternative. We had to drive back to Nairobi and get ourselves and the car onto the train, assuming the railway also had not been washed away. Eventually, having been early in the queue, we were pleased to find ourselves with 3 bunks on the bed. However, we adults got no sleep. Nigel's chattering kept us awake all day. Life had never been so exciting for a youngster. Goodness knows what Sandra thought of it all. Dusk found us again in the car, this time on the road to Niali. We came to the Mtwapa ferry for crossing a creek. In the late sunset, singing in Swahili, the African crew pulled the boat across by ropes. Hollywood and Paul Robeson could not have played it better. For Wendy, and indeed all of us, it was a romantic experience that we would remember for the rest of our days. The Nairobi Beach Hotel had grown since my visit there 7 years before. Whilst retaining its outdoor dance floor leading down under the palm trees to the beach, the hotel had been enlarged into a substantial main building with attractive rooms lying against the beach. Next day we drove to Malindi via the Kilifi ferry. The Malindi beach was littered with debris, and the Indian Ocean was muddied by the swollen waters of the Tana River which fed into it. But visiting the old Arab village was still a unique experience. Too soon it was all over. Returning to Nairobi by road with several diversions to avoid the washaways, we were entranced to find the road edges were a mass of white convolvulus flowers. These had all burst into life in a few days following the heavy rain. Quite beautiful. We were back at Quebec. Our second child was due at the end of April, and Jane was heavily pregnant. She made do with 2 maternity tents, which she made herself, washing one each day. These were the same 2 that she had used when pregnant with Nigel. "Dear God, you shouldn't have let her do that," I exploded to Jane. "There are still plenty of Mau Mau gang fragments roaming the country. I shall be responsible if anything happens to her." I had returned to Quebec early from work to find that after breakfast Wendy had taken the Hillman and departed for the Rift Valley for the day. In the event, it turned out that she had driven right down to the railway halt at the base of the Rift Valley. There she had left the car in the care of the station master and set off walking towards the extinct volcano, Mount Longonot, 9,111 feet high. Of course, she never got there. Prominent features like Longonot always look a lot closer than they actually are. She returned to Quebec that evening, exhausted and exhilarated. The next weekend we drove up to Torban, who, as always, was an excellent host, taking us to dine at the Mount Kenya Safari Club, owned by Frank Sinatra and Bill Holden. There on the terrace, entertained by the African dancers, we gazed at the floodlit gardens and lakes covered with swans. What a country, thought Wendy. Torban took her around his 10,000 acres with its buck, warthogs, rhinos, giraffes, gerenux, etc. Torban had been learning to fly, and he took a photo of Nigel seated in his aeroplane on his potholed runway. He said he was learning to fly just so that he could keep up with the other flyers in the Nanyuki Club. He really had a buccaneering spirit. Cooper fly killer aerosols were very effective, but with air movement their efficacy was quickly reduced. In effect, there was no pyrethrum left in the air to repel or kill the insects. This would always be the case when one sat on a veranda. So, Torban's reserve armament was to have fly swats available for himself and for all visitors. You knew where Torban was in the house from the loud exclamations you heard. "These bloody doo-doos!" The words being accompanied by a violent thwack with the nearest fly swat. I think he preferred to swat them rather than spray them. At South Kinangop, Bob Riley gave us his usual robust welcome and a trout supper. Normally he would catch 8 good trout in half an hour, but there was a new side to his life these days. Gone were the days when, for a little Naivasha, he had startled a visiting Impala Club hockey side by scoring 3 goals in the first half. Gone also were the days when it was rumoured that Bob's eyrie for the forest station had been the haunt of visiting French air hostesses. He was now a married man, embarrassed to admit the circumstances of his first meeting with his wife, Pat Tompkinson, a nurse of Cheshire. Apparently, Bob had done what every self-respecting Kenya lad knew would be extremely sore at best, fatal at worst. He'd had a few jars of Tusker beer and fallen asleep on the lawn in his garden under a blazing Kenya sun. Pat was a nurse at Nairobi Hospital at the time, and Bob took kindly to her nursing. During our stay, Bob walked Wendy up into the mists of the Aberdares to climb the Elephant, a nearby peak. They were up there nearly all day, Wendy in her little white house shoes. They ploughed through bamboo forest, endured the occasional flurry of snow, and Wendy arrived back delighted. A few days later at Quebec, I was flabbergasted. "You took her into the game park in this weather?" I asked Jane. "Well, it was sunny, and the game wardens assured us the road was perfect." "Yes, but you knew the ground was soaking wet. And that's what happens. You get stuck in black cotton in which she then loses a shoe trying to push the car out. And furthermore, we now have to send Wendy back home with a seriously ricked neck. But be reasonable, today was her last day. Yes, I know, but I was lost for words. I imagined Wendy trying to push the hillman in high grass, with lions, leopards, and inquisitive zebra all around her. It didn't bear thinking about. Jane had lived in Kenya for 5 years now. She knew the danger of black cotton soil, powdery when dry, like black treacle when wet. Ah well, we had done our best to give Wendy a good time. Jane and Wendy started giggling. You should have heard Nigel. Through all our trials and tribulations, every few minutes we would hear him asking politely, "Where are we going, Arnie Wenny?" It really was a hoot. I was at my most self-righteous. I was not greatly amused. A week later, I received a kind letter of thanks from John Ransford, with a welcome cheque to put towards the expenses of having entertained his daughter. In truth, we had all thoroughly enjoyed her visit.